Okay, so welcome back. Now we get to mix the plaster. So a couple things about plaster that you should know. Plaster of Paris comes in a powder form, as you probably have seen from the bag of plaster that Carolyn provided you. Try not to breathe that dust at all and keep it in a dry place so that no moisture will actually get into the actual plaster. As soon as it gets any moisture in it, it starts to set up and go bad. So it's really important that you keep it dry. Here's my plaster. I keep it in this plastic bucket that has a lid. Make sure that you don't ever spill water into that bin of plaster. A couple more things about plaster. So a little bit of chemistry here. Plaster is an exothermic chemical that when it mixes with water, it actually reacts to the water and hardens chemically. It does not simply dry by having the water slowly evaporate out, like your clay, for example. In this case, it's actually reacting chemically to the water, and exothermic means that it produces heat. So you'll notice that as the plaster sets up, it actually gets warm, sometimes even quite hot. So this is just the natural setting process of the plaster. What does that mean? Why is that important to know? It's important to know that when you're mixing plaster, if you have plaster that gets on your hands or on your tools, you don't want to wash your tools in the sink. If you wash your tools in the sink, that plaster is going to go down the drain. It will set up in your drain, and then you will have a clogged sink drain, and you'll have to call your plumber. So what you need to do is set yourself up a slop bucket to wash all the plaster off it. So here's my slop bucket. It's just a Home Depot bucket, and I've just filled it with cold water. That's all you need. That is why Carolyn provided you with the larger of the buckets. That's for all of your cleanup of the plaster. So don't do any cleanup of wet plaster in your sink. Make sure you're doing it in a slop bucket. Also, plaster is a slightly base chemical, and so you want to make sure that if you have very sensitive skin, that you wear gloves. I do notice that it dries out my skin a lot, so I would definitely recommend at least putting hand lotion on before you start with plaster, as this will protect your skin a little bit from drying out. In addition to your slop bucket, you'll need a small container for actually mixing the plaster. In this case, I'm just using a yogurt cup. I've used this multiple times. As you can see, it's already quite dirty. But make sure that there's no loose plaster that's going to mix in with the new batch that you're making. Make sure that it's nice and clean. I also have my various spatulas, which I will use for spreading the plaster once I've mixed it up. And I have my mold of my light bulb all set to go. All right, so here we go. I have a nice clean bucket, small container, and I filled it with some clean, cold water. So notice that my water is, I have about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of water in the bottom of my bucket. Do not fill your bucket fully with water, or even halfway with water. When you're mixing plaster, it is approximately 2 parts plaster to 1 part water. So if I started with half my bucket full of water and then I had to add twice as much plaster to that, I would overflow my bucket before I had mixed up enough plaster. So make sure that you start with well less than half of your bucket full of water before you ever mix plaster into it. Now I say that it's approximately 2 parts plaster to 1 part water, and that's by volume, because it's important that we don't actually follow an exact mixing ratio of 2 parts plaster to 1 part water. We actually do the plaster mixing by feel, and we use something called the island method. This is a standard method that many people use. It's very consistent in the type of plaster mix that you get when you're done. Okay, so I'm going to use a dry scoop that's different than my wet scoop, so I'm not introducing any water into my batch of plaster over there. And I'm going to slowly shake plaster into my water. And I'm not going to stir or shake or agitate the plaster in my bucket until the very, very end. So we're actually letting gravity do all the mixing for us. But this is actually the best way, so that the plaster evenly gets distributed and mixed in with water. Another chemical way of thinking about plaster is it's hydrophilic, meaning love of water. So the dry powder of the plaster actually seeks out water. So by letting the plaster slowly sink into the water, it will actually on its own mix with the water, and you don't need to do any mixing to it really at all. We do mix it at the end just to kind of speed up the process, but it will seek out the water all on its own. So the island method that I mentioned, we're going to continue to sift plaster in until we have a nice island mounted up in the middle of our bucket. So let me move the camera and you can see what that island looks like. Notice that the island is not sinking into the plaster anymore. It's staying dry for a little while. You can see it's moist around the edges, but it pretty much covers the whole surface, or the majority of the surface of the water. That's a good mix of plaster. If the island is still sinking into the water and disappearing, then you still need to add more plaster. But don't mix the plaster, don't agitate your bucket, don't shake it, don't do anything to your bucket of plaster until you're at this point of that island being formed. Now you need to let the plaster set for a couple minutes. So we're just waiting here until everything is kind of moist. You can see the water is slowly soaking into the plaster, and I just have kind of a moist center now. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a little bit of a stir. And you can just carefully, gently push that island in under the surface. And then I'm going to agitate it. Now you'll feel that island in the middle starts out feeling like a big lump. Try not to squeeze that lump, because when you compact the plaster, that makes it harder for it to absorb the water. So I'm just gently breaking up the lump with my fingers by jiggling it back and forth. And you just want to stir it until you feel all those lumps kind of go away. Now the final test to see if you have a good mix of plaster is the dip test. So at the very end, after you find all those lumps have pretty much gone away, which they're pretty much all gone now, I'll draw my hand out and notice that the plaster coats my hand and I can't see my skin through the plaster. That means I have a good mix of plaster. If I were to pull my hand out and it would run off like milk, imagine pouring milk over your hand, then my plaster is too thin and I need to add more plaster to it. That batch won't mix up, it won't set up properly. So make sure that you have a nice thick coating on your hand. Now I'm going to shake off excess plaster from my hand, and then I'm going to walk over to the slop bucket and wash my hand off really quick. This avoids any plaster being stuck down my drain or making a mess in my backyard. I want to do that quickly because my plaster starts setting up as soon as water touches it. The plaster is starting to set up. So now I'm going to just tap my bucket a little bit and get air bubbles out of it. You can see the air bubbles coming up. You can tap it, you can shake it a little bit. You're just trying to get some of those air bubbles to come out. We're going to start with a drip coat. So while it's still pretty runny, we're going to do a drip coat. Okay, so I'm going to pull my light bulb over. So the drip coat gets it, the first layer of plaster nice and thin without any air bubbles on it, and it'll get all the details of the surface of my light bulb. So I'm just going to scoop out some plaster and I'm going to drip it. Nice and thin layer. I'm going to coat my whole light bulb all the way out to the edge of my clay wall with a drip coat. Okay, now I have plaster again on my hand, so I'm going to wash it off because I don't want to get plaster all over the handle of my tool. It's just, I find it's easier to work with a clean tool. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is gently tap my board, and you can see the air bubbles coming off the surface. I don't want to do this too hard because I don't want to risk my clay wall slipping off my bulb. So that's why you make sure you have plenty of support under the side of your light bulb, under the side of the clay wall. So notice that there's some plaster running off the ends. That's perfectly fine at this stage. I'm trying to even out the surface and get all the air bubbles to come off the surface of my light bulb. Okay, so now we're going to take our spatula and we're going to continue to dribble the plaster on and build up the thickness of our mold. So you can scoop some of the plaster that's spilled, and you can also scoop plaster out of your bucket and slowly build it up. And you want to take your time doing this so that it doesn't all just completely run onto the board. And also give the plaster a chance to start to set up a little bit more. Once the plaster is set up a little bit more, we can use it to thicken our mold. So right now our mold is very, very thin, just on the surface of the bulb and the clay wall. And we want a nice even, remember our wall was 1 inch thick, 1 inch wide off the surface of our bulb. We want a nice even blanket that's 1 inch thick all the way across our entire object. Okay, so you want to build that up nice and thick. So if you find that your plaster is still just completely running off the edge, then just wait a minute and be patient. Okay, switch to hands-free mode here. So my plaster is getting nice and thick, and you can see I can mound it up and it doesn't just run right off the edge anymore. It's still a little bit liquid, still a little bit runny. I can still mold it, but it's not just completely pouring off the edge. So I could start to smooth out the surface and start to push the plaster around a little bit, very, very gently. Make sure if you're feeling impatient that you don't walk away from your batch of plaster and go check your email or your Facebook feed or your Instagram feed, because you'll come back and your plaster will have set up really quickly and you'll have to throw out that batch and start a new one. So even though it seems like you're waiting a long time for the plaster to set up, it's better to keep an eye on it and stay close to it, because it will set up quickly and then it'll be gone. It's kind of like frosting a cake. So because the plaster is still fairly fresh, I'm being very, very gentle with how I spread it, because again, I don't want to push it off of my actual light bulb. Notice I always focus on the middle, putting the plaster on the middle, and then spreading it out towards the edges. Because you want the middle to be nice and thick. Remember, it's a 1-inch thickness all the way across. So you want to take your time and make sure that it's plenty thick in the center. If you feel like your plaster is too flat across the middle, you're going to need to build it up maybe with a second batch until it's nice and round. Okay, so you can see the plaster is getting pretty set up. And I'm just trying to use every last little bit of plaster out of this bucket that I can. Might as well use it since it's still usable. Got a nice flat end, the end by my pour spout, which will actually be the top of my mold. That's where I'll pour into the mold. And as I'm going, I'm periodically scraping the outside edge of my clay wall so that I don't have a lot of plaster built up around the edge. Now my plaster is getting nice and set up, so I don't have to be quite as gentle with it. And I can start to really kind of smooth it out a little bit more. You want it to look nice and smooth. Okay, so that's pretty much all set. So here's my light bulb, first part of my mold, pretty much complete. So you can see that it's mounted up nice and round in the middle, and it should be about equal thickness the entire way across my mold. So a 1-inch thick mold. Notice that there's a little clay mixed in with the outer surface of my plaster. That won't affect anything. Don't worry about that. That's just because I scraped the edge of my wall here and got a little clay on my spatula that got mixed into the outer layer of plaster. That's totally fine. But notice that I did scrape the outside edge of my wall. You can see the clay through. There's no plaster built up around overhanging that clay wall. You can see at the tip where it kept spilling off, there's plaster down under here, but I can see my clay wall all the way through, and that way I won't have nearly as much cleanup to do once the plaster is set up as if I had a mound of plaster dripping off the edge. Okay, time for cleanup. So now I'm going to come over to my slop bucket and I'm going to clean my tools and my hands in my slop bucket. So you can use a green scrubber from your kitchen. That works really well. With a flexible rubber bucket like this, you can either clean that out with a green scrubber, or you can just wait till the plaster dries fully and then squeeze it, and the plaster will crack off the surface and come out. Either way is totally fine. But now we're just going to let our plaster on our mold set up. So we're just going to sit there and let it set for about 15 to 20 minutes. Check it every once in a while. Just put your hand on it. Don't put your hand on it right now because it's still wet. And you'll notice that it gets hot, or at least pretty warm. And that's kind of fun to feel, that process happening. All right, here we go. So I'm just going to pick this right up and take off all of this clay. Some of this clay I might be able to reuse if it's not completely covered in plaster. Okay, so got all that clay off that was supporting the walls. And then you can peel off the actual clay walls. And they should peel right off. And your light bulb should come out really easily, just like that. Look at that. A really, really nice clean mold cavity. This is the cavity of the mold, and that's, you want to be really, really careful of that surface so that you don't scrape it or create little indents or holes in it or any imperfections, because that's the actual surface of your mold where you're going to cast your material into, and you want it nice and clean without any air bubbles. Okay, so now you're going to use your fettling knife again. And we're going to clean up the edges. So remember, when we were doing the plaster, we made sure to scrape the edge of the clay wall so we didn't have a lot of plaster spilling over the edge. So that's where you start to realize why that's so important at this stage, because I just have this tiny, thin amount of plaster flashing sticking off the edge that I just need to clean up. If you have a lot where that's really thick and chunky, it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of work to clean that up. So I just have a little tiny bit, and it's really easy to scrape that off with my fettling knife. And now you can see what the pour spout looks like. So if you weren't quite sure what the pour spout was for, maybe you can sort of understand now. That's going to be where we pour material. So say this is my material, my new bulb that I've cast. That's the opening, the funnel, where I'm going to pour material into the cavity of the mold. So I'm going to clean this up. Notice that it'll be stained from the clay on the parting wall, and that's totally fine. So I have a 1-inch thick mold all the way around, and that 1 inch was guided by my clay wall that I had originally put on my light bulb. So you see how this is creating the negative form around the light bulb, and the bulb is the positive form. And that pour spout was part of our positive form. Now you want to check this edge where the parting line and the surface of the mold come together. There should be a really, really sharp edge there. And if you have any little indents or imperfections in it, now's your chance to fix them. Again, not ever touching the surface of the inside of the cavity of the mold, but just working along this edge. I can again take my fettling knife as a scraper tool, just do a little cleanup if it's needed. In my case, it wasn't really needed, but just to show you what I would do if I needed to do a little cleanup there. I'd go along the surface of my parting line. Have a tiny bit over here at the very end where the plaster kind of went a little bit in between the clay and the bulb, just a tiny bit, not really enough that I'm too worried about it. And again over here, if I get really close, you can see there's just a tiny bit of a lip there. So I can just carefully scrape that down. And you can see that my keys that I had pressed into the clay have now become little positive buttons sticking out. Just got all the dust and everything off. And this is pretty much ready for the next step.